He thought it was just another morning on the farm, but as he neared the old barn, his world turned upside down. Under a blanket on the cold ground lay 3 babies. Who were they? Why were they here? And most importantly, what did the farmer do that left everyone stunned? Subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The sky had only just begun to lighten in the east, a faint bluish hue stretching over Iowa's vast empty fields. Dew still clung to the frostbitten grass, and the land exhaled in a quiet mist drifting lazily across the bare earth. It was early March, winter's chill still lingering in the air, though spring tugged at the edges of everything. Grayson Farm, tucked at the end of a long gravel road miles from the nearest highway, stood silent and still except for the lone figure stepping onto the porch, pulling a heavy wool coat over his shoulders and adjusting his cap against the wind. Thomas Grayson, 53, weathered by more than just the sun, squinted into the morning light. His worn, cracked boots thudded dully against the wooden steps as he descended, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The flashlight wasn't really necessary, not with the faint glow creeping over the fields, but habits had settled into him like stone. Every action, every step, followed a rhythm carved by years of routine. He took a sip of coffee, wincing slightly at the bitterness, and started his usual walk toward the barn. Gravel crunched beneath his feet, the only sound in the hushed world around him. The birds hadn't started stirring yet, and even the cows still dozed in their shelter. This was his favorite time of day before noise, before responsibility, before memory. Thomas hadn't always been alone. The house behind him had once been filled with warmth, quiet laughter, and the easy comfort of companionship. His wife, Catherine, had passed 6 years ago, cancer, of course. It always seemed to be cancer. One day she was in the garden, hands in the soil, and the next, she was fading like the last breath of summer. After she was gone, Thomas retreated into the silence of the land, finding solace in the routine of chores, the loyalty of animals, and the cold, steady rhythm of the earth. They had no children. They'd tried doctors, treatments, prayers, but nothing. Just the 2 of them. Then the slow realization that maybe it wasn't meant to be. The house still had a spare bedroom. They had used it for guests once, later for storage. He hadn't opened that door in years. That morning, like so many before it, he started his round checking the feed, inspecting the fences, seeing to the hens. The barn creaked in its familiar way as he pushed open the old red door, the scent of hay and warm animal breath welcoming him in. The cows blinked at him, indifferent. He moved among them, quietly checking water levels, scooping feed, patting the side of his favorite heifer, Rosie, who leaned into him with a soft, low sound. Everything was as it should be. He stepped back outside, lifting his face slightly toward the brightening sky. The sun wasn't up yet, but enough light filtered through the clouds to cast a dull silver glow across the fields. He took another sip of coffee, standing still for a moment, listening. Then he saw it. At first, it was barely noticeably dark shape near the far edge of the property, close to the old, disused equipment shed, half hidden by the curve of the land and the tall grass growing wild around it. He thought it might be a tarp someone had left behind, or maybe an animal curled up against the cold, but something about it felt wrong. He was sure it hadn't been there yesterday. He started walking toward it, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. As he got closer, his pace slowed, unease settling in his chest. The shape took on more definition, a bundle of cloth, frayed at the edges, with something tucked beneath it. He stopped a few feet away, instincts flaring. The wind carried no sound, but he felt a shift in the air like the moment before a storm. Slowly, carefully, he crouched down, calloused fingers reaching out to lift the corner of the cloth. 3 tiny faces, barely a month old, stared up at him, eyes wide and blinking. One squirmed. Another let out a faint whimper. Their cheeks were pink from the cold, their lips trembling. Someone had wrapped them tightly in clean but warm baby clothes, layering them with blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. A plastic bag lay nearby, holding 2 small bottles, a half-used pack of diapers, and a folded piece of paper. Blank. Thomas didn't move. The world shrank down to that frozen patch of earth and the impossible weight of the moment. His breath caught. His mind, usually methodical, refused to make sense of what he was seeing. 3 infants, alone, on his land. He scanned the area instinctively, his eyes darting to the trees, the road beyond the fields, the horizon in the distance. No car, no movement, no sign of anyone. just the sky growing lighter and the wind curling through the fence posts. His heart pounded, louder than it had in years. He hesitated, then reached down, lifting one baby, then another, then the last, careful to keep them wrapped. They were heavier than they looked, but so impossibly small. The cold bit into his skin as he cradled them, struggling to hold all three at once without dropping one. He moved quickly now, no time to think, crossing the yard back toward the house. The door slammed open under his boot, and warmth hit his face as he stepped inside. One by one, he set the babies on the couch, then rushed to the fireplace, throwing logs in and sparking a fire with trembling hands. In the kitchen, he rummaged for a pot, filling it with water and setting it on the stove to warm. His mind raced. Who would do this? Why here? He grabbed the bottles, testing them one by one. The milk was cool, but they drank eagerly. His hands were steady, though his pulse hammered in his ears. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just moved, guided by something older than words. When he finally sank onto the couch beside them, he realized he hadn't taken a full breath in minutes. They were quiet now, resting, breathing, alive. The sun had risen, casting pale gold through the lace curtains. The fire popped once, and Thomas reached out absently to shift the logs. He stared at the children. He had no idea what to do next. But he knew one thing with startling clarity. He couldn't turn away. Not now. Not ever. The fire had burned low, its glow flickering across the wooden walls of the old farmhouse. Thomas sat motionless in the rocking chair, the warmth reaching only his legs, while his shoulders remained stiff and cold. The three babies lay side by side on the couch, bundled in thick quilts he had pulled from the upstairs linen chest. They slept now, tiny fists curled, faces twitching in unconscious movements. The only sounds in the room were the quiet crackling of the fire and the rhythmic breaths of the children. He had no idea how long he sat there, staring. His mind drifted in and out. Once or twice he had stood to check on the bottles, warming them again in a pot of hot water, unsure how much the babies needed or when they had last eaten. They had each taken a few ounces, enough to quiet them, to lull them back into sleep, but uncertainty gnawed at him. There was no manual for this. Whatever instincts he might have had felt buried beneath years of solitude. With stiff fingers, he reached for the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. The number was written on a yellowed card pinned to the fridge, next to a faded photo of him and Catherine from the summer of '94. Her face looked back at him as he spoke into the receiver, his voice low, cautious, as if saying the words out loud would make them real. 3 babies, left on his land. No note, no car, no sign of anyone. The dispatcher didn't know what to say at first. There was a long pause, then she said she'd send someone out. Asked if the babies were hurt. No, he said. Not that I can tell. They're warm now, fed, breathing. He gave his address again, even though they knew it, and hung up. By the time he made it back to the couch, one of the babies had stirred. The girl, he thought. She blinked up at him, cloudy blue eyes, her brow furrowed in an expression that felt strangely familiar. She let out a soft, mewling cry. He bent down, lifted her into his arms. The movement was clumsy, but his grip was steady. He bounced her gently, and she quieted. His arms ached. His back throbbed, but he didn't stop. The knock on the door came 40 minutes later, and this would qualify as an emergency kinship placement only temporary. Thomas stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. I'm not family, he said. No, she admitted, but you're the only one who's held them today. You fed them, kept them warm. That makes you the closest thing to family they've got right now. Her tone was kind, not manipulative, practical even. She saw a man in front of her who could bridge a gap. Maybe she didn't see the years of silence, the nights he still talked aloud to a woman who wasn't there, or the way his hands trembled when he held something as delicate as a newborn. Or maybe she saw all of it and didn't care. He looked down at the girl in his arms. Her eyes were closed now, mouth slack with sleep. I'll need some help, he said slowly. I'll arrange for supplies, she answered. I've never... He hesitated. I don't know what I'm doing. No one does, Reyes said. Not at first. The sheriff put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You don't have to commit to anything permanent. Just keep them safe till we figure this out. Thomas nodded, more to himself than to them. Reyes gave him a list of supplies she'd bring back formula, more diapers, a portable crib, some infant clothes. She promised to return by evening. Dalton told him to call if anything changed, then they left together, walking down the gravel road toward their vehicles. The silence in the house crept back in slowly, like fog rolling in after the wind dies. Thomas stood in the living room, the note Reyes had left in one hand, the baby in the other. The other two were still asleep, their breaths steady and soft. He didn't sit for a long time. His legs ached, and when he finally shifted the child back onto the couch beside the other scareful, not to wake, then he moved slowly to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Nothing in there suited an infant. A half-eaten casserole, a jug of milk, eggs, butter, picklesty leftovers of a life lived alone. He stared at the shelves and, for the first time in years, realized just how empty his home really was. By late morning, once the house had warmed, he sat at the table with a pencil and a legal pad, jotting down a list. Formula, bottles, wipes, something for bathing, diaper cream, baby thermometer. He didn't know what half of these things looked like, but he'd heard the terms before. He called the pharmacy in town. The woman on the other end recognized his voice and said she'd have a box ready by the time he got there. He glanced at the couch. Still sleeping. He had time. He bundled them up, wrapping them in the best blankets he had, then carried them to his truck one by one, placing them gently in a cardboard box lined with towels. He didn't have car seats. He told himself it would only be once. Just this one trip. He drove slowly, every bump in the road like a jolt to his conscience. He kept checking the rearview mirror, watching their little heads sway with each turn. They didn't cry, not once. At the pharmacy, the clerk helped him carry the supplies to the truck. She didn't ask questions, but her expression softened when she saw the children. He thanked her, barely able to meet her eyes. Back at home, he laid the babies out on the rug in front of the fire and unpacked the bag's formula. A set of pacifiers, diapers, that looked impossibly small, lotion, wipes, a thermometer, 3 onesies with animal prints, the beginnings of something. He changed them one by one, fumbling, cursing under his breath, apologizing aloud. His hands felt too big, his body too slow, but he managed. They squirmed, but none cried. By the time Reyes returned with a folding crib and a stack of paperwork, the living room looked like something between a nursery and a garage sale. She showed him how to mix the formula properly, how to burp them after feeding, how to tell if they were too hot or too cold. She left instructions, phone numbers, her cell number written in block letters. He thanked her, not knowing what else to say. When the door finally closed behind her, the house felt fuller, not noisier, just fuller. The kind of fullness he hadn't known in years, a presence. Thomas sat down beside the crib, resting his arms on his knees. He exhaled. He didn't know how long this would last. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight there were 3 children sleeping in his house, and for the first time in a long while it felt like someone else was breathing in the walls besides him. The air carried a faint trace of milk, wood smoke, and baby powder. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the worn surface, pencil in hand. In front of him was another list more detailed than any he'd made before. This wasn't just supplies or tasks. It was a plan. Feeding times, nap intervals, formula measurements, projected grocery runs, estimated monthly costs. He had done the math 3 times already and was running through it again. Not because he expected the numbers to change, but because he needed to see them, to face them, to believe he could make them work. For now he was alone in the kitchen. The babies slept in the room across the hall, what had once been a guest bedroom, but was now unmistakably a nursery. The folding cribs had been replaced with sturdy wooden ones, second-hand but solid, gifted by a couple in town who'd read about him in the county paper. The room smelled different now, less like dust and disuse, more like talcum and warmth. Toys lined the shelves, a nightlight cast a soft yellow glow after dark, and Catherine's quilt untouched in the linen closet for nearly a decade now draped the rocking chair he used every night. He glanced at the clock. The town office would open in an hour, the courthouse not long after. If he left by 10, he could have the forms filled out before noon. There was still time to change his mind, but the thought no longer lingered the way it had in the beginning. It didn't taunt him like it had on those early nights, when doubt seeped through every crack in his resolve. This wasn't impulse anymore, it was choice. A week earlier, Monica Reyes had come by for her scheduled check-in. She had brought more than just formula and a clipboard. She had brought up the next step, formally applying for temporary guardianship. It would give him access to additional resources, qualify him for state support, and, more importantly, ensure continuity of care. The children couldn't stay in limbo forever. Either he would take the next step, or the department would begin searching for permanent placement elsewhere. Thomas hadn't answered right away. He'd nodded, said he needed time to think, and she had respected that. But her words had stayed with him. Now, he stretched his shoulders and walked to the living room. The floor creaked under his weight. A week ago, the space had still looked like his old life. Now, baby things had crept into every corner, blankets draped over the couch, toys under the table, a box of diapers near the fireplace. It should have felt chaotic. It should have bothered him. Instead, it felt like someone had gently broken the seal on a long-closed room in his heart. It wasn't grief anymore. It was movement, something breathing. He moved down the hall as quietly as he could and eased open the nursery door. They were still sleeping, each in their own crib, nestled in blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling in soft rhythm. The early light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over their faces. He watched them for a while, listening to the occasional twitch of a hand or foot. They looked peaceful, as if they had never known fear, never felt cold or hunger, as if they belonged here. He didn't know their real names. The state hadn't identified them yet. No missing persons report had come in. No mother had stepped forward. On paper, they were listed only as infant A, B, and C. But in his mind, they had names born from days and nights of watching, holding, learning. He whispered them now, one for each crib, as he checked their blankets and adjusted their pacifiers. Not official, not real, just something between them and him. Back in the kitchen, he poured the last of the coffee into his thermos, grabbed his coat, and headed out. The truck started on the second try, coughing against the cold. The drive into town was quiet. Snow still clung to the ditches, but the roads were clear. He passed the same barns, the same mailboxes, the same empty fields he'd seen for decades. But they felt different now, less like landmarks on a map, and more like parts of a path. At the courthouse, the clerk greeted him with a cautious smile. She had heard, of course. Everyone had. She handed him the forms without questions, though her gaze lingered a little too long on the line where he would write his name under petitioner. He filled them out in the lobby, sitting at a table with a pen that skipped and a coffee ring staining the corner of the page. It was slow work. His handwriting wasn't what it used to be, and he double-checked every section, afraid to miss something. When he reached the line that asked about his relationship to the children, he paused. He could have written none, could have said caretaker, could have left it blank. Instead, he pressed the pen harder than necessary and wrote, prospective guardian. He handed the forms back without ceremony and nodded when the clerk said they'd be reviewed within the week. A court date might follow. A home study would be required. There would be interviews, checks, more paperwork. He didn't flinch. On his way out, he stopped at the hardware store. He needed a few things: extra locks, new window latches, a smoke detector for the nursery. The owner, an old friend of his father's, offered him a discount before he even asked. Said it was the least he could do. Told him he was doing something good. Thomas thanked him and left quickly, not trusting himself to say much else. He picked up groceries, more baby wipes, a new laundry basket. At the post office, he found 3 envelopes waiting for him, one from Child Services, one from the pharmacy, and a handwritten card with no return address. Inside was a note. You're not alone. No signature, just that. He sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at it. Then he tucked the card into the glove box and started the engine. Back at the farmhouse, he moved through the routines with practiced care. Bottles warmed, diapers changed, lullabies hummed. He was no longer guessing, not entirely. There was a rhythm now, a flow. That evening, after the babies were down and the dishes were done, he sat in the nursery with the lamp on low and the radio playing an oldie station. He rocked slowly, the creak of the chair steady and calming. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. He thought of Catherine, not with a sharp pain that used to cut through him, but with a soft ache. She would have known what to do. She would have loved them. He looked around the room, the toys, the clothes, the little lives unfolding in front of him. This wasn't just filling a gap anymore. This was a beginning. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more steps, more uncertainty. But tonight, he knew what he had chosen. They were his now. In all the ways that mattered, he kept them updated without hesitation. They're eating more now. The girl rolled over this morning. The middle boy likes music. I think as casually as if he were reporting on the weather or the grain forecast. He even started carrying a small notebook in his shirt pocket. jotting down every milestone as it happened. He wasn't sure if he'd need it for court, for documentation, or just for himself. All he knew was that when one of the boys let out his first real laugh, a full, gurgling burst of joy that startled them both, he wanted to remember the exact time of day and the song playing on the radio. It mattered. Some days were harder than other nights when none of them slept for more than an hour at a time. Mornings when a bottle hit the floor and formula sprayed everywhere. Afternoons when Thomas questioned everything. Sometimes he stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by dishes, laundry, and crying, and felt an exhaustion so deep it made his chest ache. But then one of them would curl up and doze off on his shoulder, or beam at him with a drooly grin, and the weight of it all would shift. It wasn't exactly peace, but maybe something better purpose. The farm bore the brunt of his divided attention. A few fences had been left in disrepair, the fields hadn't been tilled yet, and he had missed the early signs of a calf falling ill, spending a full day nursing it back with guilt pressing heavy on him. But seasons always moved forward. There was time to catch up. The soil would wait. He hired a lanky, awkward teenager from town to help out on Saturdays. The kid didn't ask a lot of questions, which suited Thomas just fine. He showed him how to feed the animals, check the water lines, clean the stalls. The boy caught on quick and didn't mind the long hours. Said the farm was quieter than home. One afternoon, while stacking hay, he suddenly asked, "You really keeping them? The babies, I mean?" Thomas straightened up, met his gaze, and nodded. "I am." The boy just shrugged, like it was the most obvious answer in the world, and went back to work. That night, after baths and clean pajamas, Thomas carried each baby to the nursery. He read to them before bed, not that they understood the words, but they seemed to like the sound of his voice. Sometimes he read old farm almanacs, sometimes children's books, sometimes whatever newspaper was lying around. It didn't matter. The rhythm of it did. Sitting in the rocking chair with one of them tucked against his chest, he let his eyes wander the room. The soft hum of the baby monitor, the weight of the child in his arms, the moonlight stretching shadows across the floor, it all settled around him. He thought of Catherine often these days, but not in the raw, painful way he once had. It was softer now, like her memory had become part of the house itself. Sometimes, when the kids were asleep, he found himself talking to her, telling her about the day, the little victories, the things she'd find funny. He liked to imagine her listening, smiling. Maybe she was. He didn't know how the world worked beyond what he could see, but he knew one thing: she would have loved these kids, seen them for what they were, not burdens, not question marks, gifts. He closed his eyes, letting the chair rock them both into stillness. Even now, part of him struggled to believe it that 3 babies could show up in his life out of nowhere and somehow become the center of it all. That he, a man who had spent years in silence, could learn to live in the noise. But he had. And the farm would find its way just like he would. He rose, laid the baby gently in the crib, whispered something to each of them, then turned off the light. Outside, the stars stretched clear and sharp across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then quieted. The wind was shifting. The fields waited. The house was full. The rhythm of life had settled into something that felt, if not effortless, at least steady. Mornings began with soft light cutting through the bedroom window and muffled baby cries down the hall. Thomas woke before the alarm, not just from habit but from need. 3 small lives waiting on the other side of the door. Bottles warmed while coffee brewed. The stove ticked to life. Floorboards creaked under his feet as he moved from crib to crib, lifting, changing, feeding, soothing. It wasn't strange anymore. It wasn't a disruption. It was just life. The seasons were shifting too. The wind coming off the plains carried less bite, more warmth. The ground was beginning to give. When the kids were asleep and the chores allowed it, Thomas would walk the edge of the fields, feeling the softened dirt under his boots, listening to the birds reclaiming their seasonal posts. The land was waking up. Everything was starting again. But even as the house grew brighter and the days fuller, a shadow began creeping into the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't one thing, it was little moments accumulating. A phone call from Monica Reyes, her tone clipped. A letter from the state, stamped with bureaucratic language about formal evaluations and oversight. A new voice from Family Services asking to schedule a home visit. Then, the final Dropa knock on the door early Thursday morning. A woman introduced herself as Elaine Murray, a regional case supervisor assigned to review the unusual circumstances of the placement. Early 40s, neat, professional, pleasant but distant. She wasn't here for small talk. She was here to decide. She asked to see the kids first. Thomas led her through the house with the quiet steadiness he relied on these days. The nursery was spotless. The babies, freshly changed and fed, lay in their cribs or on the playmat, blinking up at the stranger. She crouched beside them, observing, taking notes. Not unkind, but not warm either. Thomas watched, arms crossed. Then came the questions. In the kitchen, she pulled out a folder and started running through their routines. Health records, income, insurance, doctor visits. He answered steadily. His voice didn't waver. Then she got to the heart of it. "What are your long-term intentions, Mr. Grayson?" "I'm filing for permanent guardianship," he said. She looked up from her notes. "And you understand what that means?" "I do. It's a lifelong commitment. I'm aware." A pause. He felt it stretch between them like a taut wire. "You live alone?" she said carefully. "You're in your 50s. This would be an extraordinary undertaking for anyone, even with support. Do you have a network?" He gestured to the list of names pinned to the fridge: neighbors, friends, the part-time nurse who came twice a week. "We get by." She nodded but didn't look convinced. Her eyes swept the kitchen, the clean counters, the bottles drying in the rack, the neatly arranged toys in a basket by the door. "It's admirable," she said finally, "what you've done." Thomas stayed quiet. He knew what was coming next. "But we have to consider the best interests of the children." There it was. The phrase he'd been dreading. Not his love. Not the warmth of their little bodies asleep under his roof. Not the nights spent rocking them back to sleep, or the mornings spent easing their cries. None of that mattered if someone else decided it wasn't enough. She left after another 30 minutes, taking her folder and polite detachment with her, said she'd be in touch, that a formal review was coming. He walked her to the door, watched her car disappear down the gravel road, dust rising behind it. That night, after the kids were asleep, he sat in the dark, staring at the fire. The fear settled in, not loud or panicked, but cold and quiet. The kind that curled up in the corners of his mind and whispered, "What if they take them? What if everything you've done still isn't enough? What if they don't believe in you?" The next morning, he made calls. Monica first, she was sympathetic but firm. "You knew this was part of it, Thomas." "I want to be ready," he said. "I want to do this right." She told him to find a lawyer, gather letters, build his case. So he did. The pastor, the nurse, the pharmacist, the feed store owner, the retired teacher, they all said the same thing. He's showing up. He cares. The lawyer, Jill Whitaker, was sharp and efficient. They'll look for reasons to say your age, your income, your lack of a partner. And what do I have? Consistency, a clean record, a community that believes in you, and 3 kids who already see you as theirs. He did the work. Forms, appointments, first aid courses, CPR training. Fear turned to something sturdier: resolve. The night before the review, he read to them, voice steady even as his hands trembled. He whispered promises they wouldn't understand. Tomorrow, everything might change. But tonight, they were his, and he would fight for them with everything he had. The morning of the hearing arrived, wrapped in a thick, cold mist. The sky above the Grayson farm stretched in an unbroken expanse of soft gray, the kind that held the sun at bay and hushed the world. Dew clung to the gravel drive, making it glisten in the dim light, while the barn stood still in silhouette, as if holding its breath. Thomas woke before his alarm, not roused by the stirring of the babies but by the weight in his own chest. He lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the old house, the hush of the wind outside. Today, everything would come to a head: the work, the uncertainty, the fragile hope he had built over the past weeks. All of it would be measured by someone who didn't know him, someone who might have never set foot on a farm, never heard a calf's first breath, never rocked a feverish child through the night. But it wasn't anger that rose in him. It was something deeper: a readiness. He got up and dressed in the quiet, pulling from the back of the closet the same button-down shirt he had worn on his wedding day, preserved all these years in plastic. It still fit, though his shoulders had broadened, and the fabric had long since lost the lavender scent Catherine used to tuck into the drawers. Still, there was something right about it. He fastened each button carefully, rolled his sleeves just to the wrist, and glanced in the mirror above the dresser. The man staring back at him was lined, tired, but solid. No fear in his eyes this morning, only resolve. The babies woke as they always did. Unaware of the gravity of the day ahead, one cried for milk, another for a change, The third simply because the room had grown too quiet. Thomas moved through the motions with practiced ease, hands sure, thoughts steady. Bottles were already warmed, the diaper bag packed, their outfits laid out the night before, 3 soft onesies, a matching set gifted by a neighbor whose own children had long since grown. By 7:30, they were in the truck, bundled in clean blankets, secured in second-hand car seats donated by a woman at church. He checked each one twice, tightening the straps, adjusting the mirrors. The heater hummed as he pulled onto the road, mist clinging to the edges of the windshield. The drive to the county courthouse took just over an hour. The truck rumbled steadily over back roads, the fog peeling away like a curtain as the sun made a muted attempt to rise. Thomas spoke little, humming softly when one of the boys fussed, his hand steady on the wheel, his mind fixed on what was coming. He arrived with time to spare. Jill Whitaker was waiting at the entrance, clipboard in hand, dressed in a navy blazer and gray slacks that made her look even younger than she was. She smiled when she saw the children, reaching out to adjust the edge of a blanket with careful fingers. "They look good," she said. "They are," Thomas replied. He carried the twins himself, one in each arm, while Jill took the third. The courthouse security guard gave them a passing glance, but didn't bother stopping a man with 3 infants and a lawyer at his side. They took the elevator to the 3rd floor and sat outside courtroom C, the bench hard beneath them, the overhead lights too bright, too cold. Inside, the room was simple oak benches, a raised platform for the judge, a state seal mounted on the wall. The air carried the faint scent of furniture polish and coffee. A clerk moved about quietly, arranging files on the judge's desk. A social worker Thomas recognized from an earlier visit sat a few rows back, flipping through notes. The babies, drowsy from the ride and the lull of warm air, settled into a doze. Jill leaned over, whispering last-minute instructions, though Thomas already knew them: when to speak, when to listen, what to expect. At precisely 9 o'clock, the judge entered. She was older than Thomas had anticipated, with silver hair pulled back tightly and glasses low on her nose. Her expression gave nothing away as she greeted the room and called the hearing to order. She addressed each person in turn. Thomas, Jill, the representatives from Child Protective Services, opened a folder and began to read. The proceedings started methodically: case summary, status of the infants, initial discovery report, emergency placement authorization. Thomas listened as his life was reduced to dry: official termship's name, occupation, the day he found the children, his assumption of care. Jill spoke next, presenting the binder. They had compiled records of Thomas's daily routine, health documents, financial statements, letters from neighbors, statements from the visiting nurse and local pastor. She spoke clearly, confidently, the kind of certainty that came from thorough preparation. Thomas watched the judge's eyes as she turned each page, brow furrowing slightly, then smoothing again. Then came the testimony. The visiting nurse took the stand first, speaking with warmth and calm authority. She described Thomas's attentiveness, his patience, his ability to follow instructions. She spoke of how the children responded to him, how they were thriving under his care. Next was the pastor, a soft-spoken man with a dark suit and a worn leather Bible tucked into his coat pocket. He didn't just speak to Thomas's character. He spoke to the change he had witnessed in him since the children arrived, how a man once lost to grief had softened, had found something worth holding on to again. Finally, Thomas was called. He stood, handed the last baby to Jill, and walked to the front of the room. Silence settled over the courtroom as the judge asked him to state his name, his intent, his understanding of what he was asking for. "I'm not young," he said simply. "I don't have a perfect house or a big family, but I have a home, and I have room in it for them. I've learned to care for them. I've come to love them. And I'm willing to spend the rest of my life making sure they're safe and loved in return." No dramatic pause, no rehearsed speech, just the truth, spoken plainly. The judge nodded and turned to the CPS representative. A younger woman, unfamiliar to Thomas, stood and gave a measured response. She acknowledged the unusual circumstances, the potential concerns, but she also acknowledged the clear evidence of care, the lack of better alternatives, the overwhelming statements of support. The judge asked one last question. "Do you understand that this is permanent? That this is not a placeholder or a gesture? That in the eyes of the law, these children will be yours, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails?" "I do," Thomas said. "And you're prepared to take that on, now and for the future?" I am. The judge glanced down at her notes, then at the babies, who stirred softly in Jill's arms and the carrier beside the table. I have reviewed the documents, the testimony, and the department's recommendation, she said. I find that it is in the best interest of the minors to remain in the care of Mr. Thomas Grayson. The petition for guardianship is hereby granted. A pause. Congratulations, Mr. Grayson. They are yours. For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. Beside him, he heard Jill exhale. The silence in the courtroom shifted, warmed. The babies, oblivious to the weight of the moment, began to fuss, and he moved instinctively, lifting one into his arms, rocking gently. People approached him, the nurse, the pastor, even the court clerk. There were handshakes, murmured blessings, congratulations. Jill placed a hand on his shoulder, eyes shining. They left the courthouse together, stepping into air that had finally turned toward spring. The mist had lifted. Sunlight broke through in patches, warming the pavement beneath their feet. Thomas secured the babies in the truck, lingering for just a moment, hands on the roof, eyes on the sky. They were his. No more waiting, no more uncertainty, no more questions. As he drove home, the land stretched out before him, familiar, yet new. The farm awaited, the fields, the life he thought had ended. But it hadn't ended. It had begun again, and this time he wasn't alone. They called her Miss Ada, and her voice, warm and steady, filled the nursery with the gentle rhythm of nursery rhymes and bedtime stories. The children didn't grow in sudden spurts, but in the quiet, steady way that all living things do when nurtured with love. They began to roll over, to laugh more often, to reach for him when he entered the room. Their personalities took shape. The girl was the calmest, her watchful eyes taking in the world with quiet focus. The middle boy was loud and eager, always moving, always the first to cry and the first to laugh. The youngest remained his little dreamer, happiest when curled up against Thomas's chest, thumb in his mouth, the world at a comfortable distance. As spring deepened, Thomas built a play yard near the porch, fencing off a soft patch of grass where they could lie beneath the open sky. He stretched a canopy overhead to shade them from the sun, lined the ground with thick blankets, and set out cushions for them to tumble on. The dog, ever watchful, kept a steady vigil nearby. From the porch, Thomas could see them clearly as he shelled peas, mended tools, or simply sat with a glass of water in hand, letting the warmth of the season settle into his bones. He talked to them often not just the sing-song rhythms of lullabies, but real stories. Old stories. The ones Catherine used to coax out of him late at night, when the fields were quiet and the stars pressed close. He told them about their grandmother, how she planted lavender behind the barn because she liked the way it caught the morning light. He told them about the time he got caught in a harvest storm, and how she had waited for him on the porch, towel in hand, ready with both warmth and a well-earned scolding. He told them how, once upon a time, he and Catherine had dreamed of a house filled with children, how that dream had faded in silence and loss. And then he told them the most important thing, that even though they had come to him in the most unexpected of ways, even though he did not know who had left them or why, they were not accidents. They were not burdens. They were not mysteries to be solved. They were his children. They were the seeds he had unknowingly planted, the harvest he had never dared hope for. He marked their milestones with quiet reverence, the first tiny tooth, the first time one of them sat up on their own, the first babbled sound that might have been his name. He kept notes in a small, worn notebook, circled dates on the calendar, and pinned photographs above the mantel. He built shelves for their toys, added a new swing to the porch, and planted a young apple tree beside the garden, a wooden sign at its base carved with their initials. That summer, the house no longer echoed. It was filled with sound, the hum of soft radio tunes, the shuffle of tiny feet against the worn wood floors, the steady creak of the rocking chair. Thomas's voice, low and soothing, wove through it all as he read to them at night. The windows stayed open to the breeze, and the curtains swayed like ghosts in the moonlight. He sat in the quiet darkness, listening to their breathing, and thinking sometimes with wonder, sometimes with deep certainty, that this was the life he had been meant for all along. He still worked the land, though differently now. He adjusted his routines, planted fewer acres, focused on what he could manage. He sold some of the old equipment, using the money to expand the nursery, to buy more books, a sturdier stroller, a second-hand high chair. It was a different kind of work, now not just tending to the land, but tending to a future. In August, on a warm Sunday morning, he took them to church for the first time. The congregation welcomed them without hesitation, and the pastor spoke of second chances, of families made not by blood, but by grace. The babies wiggled and giggled through the hymns, and Thomas stood in the back, one in each arm, the third asleep against his chest. Afterward, people came to talk not with pity, not with awe, but with kindness. They asked about names, about sleep schedules, about what they could bring next time. A woman pressed a small, folded note into his hand. Later that night, when the house was quiet, he opened it. It read simply, "You have made a family. Never let the world make you question that." And he didn't. Not anymore. The days passed, one after another, like beads on a string. Some were hard, some were easier. Most were beautiful in ways he hadn't expected. Tiny moments strung together laughter. A first step, a muddy handprint on the porch rail, a whispered word, a shared glance. A life unfolding in quiet joy. By the time the first leaves began to turn, the babies were crawling. The girl reached the window first, pulling herself up to peer outside, her wide eyes filled with wonder. The others followed, each in their own time, each with their own determined will. Thomas watched them, feeling a pride deeper than anything he had ever known. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, he sat with them on the porch. The sky streaked in gold and rose. The apple tree by the garden had grown taller, its leaves thick and dark, its branches stretching higher toward the fading light. He held the youngest in his lap, the other two resting against his legs. They gazed out over the quiet farm, and Thomas gazed with them. The land was resting, and in the hush between seasons, in the stillness of twilight, he whispered to them what he now knew with absolute certainty. "You are home," he said. And so were they,